Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Thanks. Hello, and welcome to our celebration of cartooning and the opening of our two new exhibits, Cartoon County, the Golden Age of Cartooning in Connecticut, and the State of Cartooning. I'm Carole Erger-Fass, and I'm exhibit curator at the library. We picked this date months ago, and little did we know that we would turn out to be the comic relief before the presidential debate. So we promise we'll be finished with plenty of time for you to get home and watch, and I'll try to keep this as short as I can. Cartoon County, the Golden Age of Cartooning in Connecticut, is a collaboration with the Westport Public Art Collections and features over 40 original artworks from the town's cartoon collection of over 120 works. Most were created during the mid-20th century when comics flourished by artists who lived and worked in Westport and surrounding towns. Guest curator Brian Walker and I worked closely with Westpac co-chairs Eva Cavacci and Ann Boberski to choose the selection of historic story strips, gags, political cartoons, and humor strips by some of our area's legends, including Dick Brown, Mel Casson, Stan Drake, John Cullen Murphy, Leonard Starr, Mort Walker. Okay, I'll keep it short. And as a complement to this fascinating look back, the State of Cartooning looks forward and features original artwork by cartoonists who are members of the Connecticut chapter of the National Cartoonist Society and are actively working in the field. I would like to thank Maria Scrivan, Sean Kelly, Bob Engelhart, and Bill Janoka for coming tonight and sharing their work with us. And by the way, you'll have another chance to meet Brian and some of the artists on Saturday, September 21st at 2 p.m. when they will be hosting a panel discussion of cartooning at Storyfest. Our presenter and storyteller this evening is Brian Walker, son of Mort Walker, who, along with his brothers Neil and Greg, grew up in Cartoon County, literally surrounded by many of the comic legends showcased in the exhibit. Brian's background in professional cartooning and cartoon scholarship would take a night in itself to cover, so in an effort to keep it brief, his credits include founder and former director of the Museum of Cartoon Art, part of the creative team that produces the comic strips Beetle Bailey and Hi and Lois, author and contributor to 45 books on cartoon art, including the comics, the complete collection, a teacher of cartoon history at School of Visual Arts, a curator of 75 cartoon exhibitions, editor-in-chief of Collector's Showcase magazine, and the founder and current chairman of the Connecticut chapter of the National Cartoonist Society. And before I turn this over to Brian, I want to thank the library's incredibly dedicated volunteer art committee for all of their time and their expertise, and also for Tom Bernstein for taking on the challenge of getting those giant blow-ups of Mort Walker's drawings on the gallery walls and making it look so great. And finally, thanks to the library's media team for recording tonight's presentation, which will be available on our website sometime after the event. Brian?
All right, let me get my clicker out. Well, thanks, Carole. And thank you for the great job you did on the exhibit. It was fun working with you and all the staff at Westpac. I would also like to thank Cullen Murphy for letting us borrow the title of his wonderful book about cartoonists in Fairfield County. This quote from the book sums up the theme of this exhibit. For a period of about 50 years, right in the middle of the American century, many of the nation's top comic strip cartoonists, gag cartoonists, and magazine illustrators lived within a stone's throw of one another in the southwestern corner of Connecticut, a bit of Bohemia amid those men in their gray flannel suits. As the sons of well-known cartoonists, Cullen and I were lucky to be born into this extended family of colorful characters. That's a photo there of Cullen dressed as the Yellow Kid for a syndicate promotion with his dad in 1956. This map of Fairfield County was drawn by my father, Mort Walker, for the National Cartoonist Society Rubin program in 1977. It shows most of the cartoonists who lived in the area. The majority of cartoonists work by themselves in their home studios and look for opportunities to socialize with other cartoonists. This is Mort's 40th birthday party at the Millbrook Club in Greenwich in 1963. All of these cartoonists are now gone. Their favorite activity was golf, and Mort was the one who organized all the foursomes. That's him kneeling in the foreground at a golf outing with other Connecticut cartoonists in the 1970s. You'll see pictures of some of these guys later, so I won't identify all of them. Here's Mort teeing off at the Silvermine Golf Club, where he was a member for over 50 years, followed by dinner with Bill Yates, Stan Drake, and Dick Brown. The Connecticut Cartoonist Invitational Golf Tournament celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2007. The winner got a pie thrown in his face. I'm not sure who that is. It looks like Kurt Swan. The joke telling was always above par and out of bounds. Another favorite golf course was Longshore in Westport. Dick Brown did this amazing watercolor painting of Longshore for a birthday card in the 1980s. That's Dick sitting in the middle waiting to take his shot. This is a home movie of cartoonists playing golf in the tournament in the 1960s. That's Dick Brown. Bob Gustafson. That's Mort. Jerry Dumas. Wasn't much of a golfer, but I'm not sure who that is. His head is cut off. They teed off of mattresses and drew their cartoon characters on the greens. During the off-season, there was a bowling league. They drew the characters on their shirts. By the 1960s, my father's staff was turning out so many comic strips, the studio in Greenwich was dubbed King Features East. In this photo from the early 1980s are, back row left to right, Frank Johnson, Bob Gustafson, Bud Jones, and Jerry Dumas. Greg Walker and Mort are in the front. All of them lived in Fairfield County. The Museum of Cartoon Art opened in Greenwich in 1974. Kurt Swan did this drawing of the Mead Mansion, the original home of the museum. Fairfield County was the ideal location for the museum since there were so many cartoonists around. They appeared as guest speakers and came to all of our exhibit openings. Drank a lot of our booze. In 1977, the museum moved across the county line to Ward's Castle in Rye Brook, New York. The drawing by John Cullen Murphy was used on all of our promotional materials. This photo of cartoonists posing with their characters was at the Castle Warming fundraiser in 1977. It appeared in People magazine. We raised over $30,000 that night. Many cartoon characters also live in Fairfield County. Lois Flagstone of High and Lois did her shopping for art supplies at Max's in Westport. This photo of local artists in front of Max's art supply is from 1981, courtesy of Miggs Burroughs. Max's closed in 2014. It's fun to pick out all the cartoonists in there. Dick Hodgins, I see, Leonard Starr, Stan Drake. I think that's Chance way in the back. Mario's was across the street from the Westport train station and was a popular hangout for the cartoonists. They often had to take the train to New York to hand deliver their work to their editors, particularly when they were behind on their deadlines. Cartoonists always had a unique take on the commuter experience. Before the golden age of the 1960s and 70s, a number of legendary creators settled in Fairfield County. A pioneering female cartoonist, Rose O'Neill, created the iconic Kewpies in 1909. In 1921, she purchased a stucco tile roof villa on the Saugatuck River that she named Castle Carabas, which became an influential artist salon. Johnny Gruelle moved from Indiana to Silvermine in 1910. He started drawing cartoons for the New York Herald, where he created Mr. Tweedledee in 1911. After his daughter Marcella died in 1915, he was inspired to write a story starring her doll Raggedy Ann, and the rest is history. He died in Florida in 1938 and is buried in the cemetery on Silvermine Road. Harold Gray, who created Little Orphan Annie in 1924, moved to Westport in 1929. He did this drawing of Annie, Sandy, and Daddy Warbucks for fellow cartoonist Morris Weiss. Helen Hokinson started selling her work to the New Yorker in 1925 and did 1,700 cartoons for the magazine before her death in a plane crash in 1949. Her studio was in a little pink cottage in Silvermine. Alice Harvey and Helen Hokinson were roommates in New York in 1921 and lifelong friends. One of the original New Yorker artists when the magazine was launched in 1925, she moved to Westport in 1929. Alex Raymond created the legendary adventure strip Flash Gordon in 1934. After serving in World War II, he started the detective strip Rip Kirby. He moved to Stamford in 1940, but was killed in a tragic accident driving Stan Drake's Corvette in Westport in 1956. Stan survived. Born in the Bronx, Ernie Bushmiller was, who's clapping? I know, was the youngest cartoonist to have a syndicated comic strip when he took over Fritzy Ritz in 1925. Nancy was introduced in 1933 and took over the strip in 1938. One of the most successful cartoonists in the business by the end of the mid-40s, Ernie and his wife Abby moved to Stamford in 1950. Born in Canada, Hal Foster did an illustrated adaptation of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan from 1929 to 1937 and created the epic adventure strip Prince Valiant in 1938. He lived in Reading from 1944 to 1971 before retiring to Florida. The exhibits here provide only a sampling of the many cartoonists who have a Connecticut connection. This is a more comprehensive list. I won't read it, but those are all the people that got left out. It's hard to include everybody. The Westport School's permanent art collection was conceived by local art teacher Bert Chernow, shown here. who began acquiring paintings, watercolors, drawings, prints, illustrations, cartoons, photographs, sculptures, and murals in 1964. Westport cartoonist Mel Casson was instrumental in building the cartoon collection, which includes over 120 original comic strips, gag cartoons, editorial cartoons, and illustrations. Over the years, the Westpac collection has been displayed in schools, in public buildings around town to educate and entertain the residents. We picked some highlights from Westpac's collection for the Cartoon County exhibit and grouped them by genre. Dick Brown, who claimed he didn't look like his main character, resided in Wilton before moving to Florida, co-created Hi and Lois with Mort Walker in 1954, and launched his own strip, Hagar the Horrible, in 1973. A resident of Greenwich, Mort Walker was one of the most prolific cartoonists of all time. He was involved in the creation of 9 syndicated comic strips, the most successful being Beetle, Bailey, and Hi and Lois. Jerry Dumas was hired as Mort Walker's assistant in 1956. They co-created Sam Strip in 1961, which was relaunched as Sam and Silo in 1977. He also lived in Greenwich. Popeye was first introduced by E.C. Segar in his Thimble Theater comic strip in 1929. Westport resident Bud Sagendorf worked on the feature from 1948 until his death in 1994. Fred Laswell was hired as Billy DeBeck's assistant on Barney Google in 1933 and took over the strip when DeBeck died in 1942. He renamed it Snuffy Smith and continued it for 59 years. He lived in Redding Ridge before moving to Tampa, Florida. Bill Yates had a long career as a gag cartoonist and strip creator before becoming comics editor at King Features Syndicate in 1978. He lived in Westport for 50 years. The strip on the bottom is the final farewell for his character, Professor Fumble. The dean of the cartoon community in Westport, Mel Casson, began submitting cartoons to the Saturday Evening Post in 1937. He co-created the comic strip Mixed Singles, later renamed Boomer, with William F. Brown in 1972. Bill was also a Westport resident. Jack Tippett was a top-selling gag cartoonist. And he produced both Amy and Henry and drew cartoons for the Westport News. He served as the director of the Museum of Cartoon Art when it opened in Greenwich in 1974. He was our boss, Chuck Green and me. Bob Weber Sr. based many of the gags in his domestic comedy strip Moose on his own family life. He lived in Westport, where he passed away in 2000. Hubert, who made his debut in the Stars and Stripes newspaper in 1942, transitioned to civilian life after the war. Dick Wingert was a Westport resident for many years. A contributing gag writer for Mort Walker's Funny Factory, Bud Jones co-created this strip about a multi-millionaire with Frank Ridgway in 1958. They both lived in Weston. A graduate of Boston's Museum School of Fine Arts, Bob Gustafson did Tilly the Toiler for 8 years before joining Mort Walker's staff in 1962. He drew the Beetle Bailey comic book and wrote gags for Beetle, Hi and Lois, and Boner's Art. He lived in Old Greenwich. Frank Johnson started out drawing comic books before assisting on Hi and Lois and Beetle Bailey. He continued producing Boner's Ark for many years and also illustrated the long-running strip Bringing Up Father, starring Maggie and Jiggs. He lived in Fairfield. This classic soap opera strip was created by Stan Drake in 1953 and ran until 1989. Elliot Kaplan, who wrote the stories, was the brother of Al Cap. Stan moved to Westport in 1960 and drew Blondie from 1984 to 1997. Mary Perkins on Stage was written and illustrated by Leonard Starr from 1957 to 1979. It won the Best Story Strip Award from the National Cartoonist Society in 1960 and 1963. Leonard moved to Westport in 1970, took over the revived Annie strip in 1979 after the success of the Broadway musical. He continued producing it until he retired in 2000. John Prentice, who shared a studio in downtown Westport with Stan Drake for many years, took over the popular detective strip Rip Kirby in 1956 when the creator, Alex Raymond, was killed in a car accident. He continued it until his death in 1999. The artist most associated with Superman from the 1950s to the 1980s, Curt Swan, drew hundreds of stories and covers for DC Comics. He died in Wilton on June 17, 1996. Jack Murphy, who lived in Coscob, was a successful magazine illustrator before he created the boxing strip Big Ben Bolt in 1950. He started working with Hal Foster on Prince Valiant in 1970 and continued it for 3 decades. A veteran comic book artist, Frank Boll, worked on many comic strips, including On Stage, Winnie Winkle, Juliet Jones, Annie, Gilthorpe, and Apartment 3G. He lived in Weston. Veteran comic book artist Tony DiPreta drew both Joe Palooka from 1959 to 1984 and Rex Morgan, MD, from 1983 to 2000. He was born in Stamford and lived in Greenwich. This strip about 2 teenage girls was created by Westport resident Dick Brooks in 1950. He continued it until 1979. That's his daughter, Virginia, who assisted him on the strip for the last 6 years. Gil Kane, who lived in Wilton, worked for every major comic book publisher during his 50-year career. He collaborated on the science fiction strip Starhawks with mystery writer and Ridgefield resident Ron Goulart. A versatile artist, Gil Fox drew comic books, panels, and strips, as well as magazine, advertising, editorial, and sports cartoons during his long career. He lived in Reading. Orlando Bucino had a long career as a gag cartoonist and creator of the dog character Gus for Boys Life magazine in 1970. He died in Ridgefield in 2022, one of the last of the Golden Age cartoonists. Best-selling gag cartoonist Jerry Marcus produced Trudy, starring a suburban housewife from 1963 to 2005. He lived in Ridgefield, Danbury, and Waterbury. Longtime Westport resident Judd Hurd, who created the syndicated panels Ticker Tunes and Health Capsules, also edited Cartoonist Profiles magazine from 1969 to 2005. Bob Weber Jr. produces the children's features Slylock Fox for King Features, which has a readership of over 30 million. He also writes gags for Hagar the Horrible. New Canaan resident Charles Saxon sold his first cartoon to the New Yorker in 1943 and went on to do 30 covers and over 700 cartoons for the magazine. A regular contributor to The New Yorker for 5 decades, Whitney Darrow drew more than 1,500 cartoons for the magazine. He lived in Wilton and was an instructor for the famous Artist School cartoon course in Westport. Donald Riley sold over 1,000 cartoons and 16 covers to The New Yorker, and also had work published in Collier's, Look, Playboy, and Mad. He died in Norwalk on June 18, 2006. Joseph Ferris began contributing to The New Yorker in 1957 and sold over 300 cartoons to the magazine. He lived in Bethel. Warren King started his career in comic books and as an assistant to Rube Goldberg before getting a job as the editorial cartoonist for the New York Daily News, where he worked from 1955 to 1977. He lived in Wilton. A longtime resident of Wilton, Dick Hodgins worked on the Half-Hitch, Henry, and Hagar the Horrible comic strips, and was an editorial cartoonist for the New York Daily News in the 1970s. Robert Durham worked as a freelance illustrator in New England from 1979 to 1994, before returning to Nashville to concentrate on his paintings, which have been exhibited nationally and internationally. That's his self-portrait. Little drawing lesson. All those graphics are from my father's book, The Lexicon of Comicana, which is going to be reprinted next year by the New York Review of Books. Children's book illustrator and advertising artist Hardy Gramatke started his career as an animator at Walt Disney Studios and worked as a ghost on the comic strip Ella Cinders. He died in Westport on April 29, 1979. Eric Gurney was a story artist at Walt Disney Studio in the 1930s and had a long career as a freelance illustrator. He lived on Hillendale Road in Westport. A prolific and successful freelance cartoonist, Roy Doty did jobs for clients in publishing, syndication, advertising, television, product packaging, and nonprofit. He lived in the Silver Mine neighborhood of Norwalk. Bob Bugg had a long career as a magazine and advertising illustrator and worked as an assistant to Hank Ketchum on Dennis the Menace from 1972 to 1982. He lived in New Canaan with his wife Pat he moved to New Canaan with his wife Pat in 1955. Howard Muntz was a painter, illustrator, graphic designer, cartoonist, sculptor, writer, teacher, and an active member of Westport's artistic community. He died on March 5, 2016 at the age of 100. This section of the exhibit features artwork by contemporary cartoonists who live in Connecticut. The logo was designed by Chance Brown. When we started the Connecticut chapter of the National Cartoon Society in 1993, many Golden Age cartoonists were still around. Meetings were held at local restaurants, including the Silvermine Tavern, Cobb's Mill Inn, the Reading Roadhouse, the Red Barn. These places seemed to close after we had our dinners there. I don't know why. From 1994 to 2017, a special Legend Award was presented to 22 Connecticut cartoonists at our annual fall dinners. Although membership has decreased as the older generation has passed on, the Connecticut chapter is still active. Here we are voting on the annual awards at Mort's studio in Stamford. Ray Billingsley won the Reuben as the Outstanding Cartoonist of the Year in 2020, and is the creator of Curtis, which appears in more than 250 newspapers nationwide. Working from his studio in Stamford, Billingsley balances his life with family, friends, and his faithful companion, Higgins the Basset Hound. Maria Scrivan's syndicated comic, Half Full, appeared in daily newspapers for a decade and is now available 3 days a week online. She also designs greeting cards, and her cartoons have appeared in Mad Magazine, Parade, Highlights, and National Lampoon. Not Enough, her debut graphic novel, was an instant New York Times bestseller and launched her critically acclaimed 6-book series of the same name. She lives in Greenwich and is here tonight. Bob Engelhardt, who is also here, began his editorial career at Chicago Today before moving on to the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, the Dayton, Ohio Journal-Herald, and the Hartford Courant. Engelhardt is the author of 2 cartoon collections, a memoir, and a novel. He lives in Middletown with his wife, Pat. Sean Kelly has done illustrations for the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Entertainment Weekly, New York, Business Week, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, and the New York Times. He has received honors from the Society of Illustrators, the Society of Publication Designers, and the National Cartoonist Society. Sean lives in Southport. Bill Janoka is a cartoonist and illustrator who majored in illustration at Syracuse University. He did jobs for Walt Disney Productions, Marvel, Mad Magazine, and Pee-wee's Playhouse before becoming Mort Walker's studio assistant in 1987, where he worked for over 30 years. He lives with his family in Stamford. After his father, Dick Brown, launched Hagar the Horrible in 1973, Chance Brown stepped in to help with Hi and Lois. He also served as editor for Hagar, which was drawn by his brother, Chris. A true Renaissance man, Chance still found time to paint, do freelance graphic design, and play blues guitar. He lived in Wilton. That's him in the middle. Eric Reeves began cartooning professionally in 1994 when he joined Paws Incorporated and helped draw the Garfield comic strip for 17 years. In 2009, he began assisting Chance Brown on Hi and Lois and joined Brown Creative Enterprises full-time in 2012. He lives with his wife and 5 children in Marion, Indiana. Greg Walker started his cartooning career writing and drawing comic books, and began providing gags to his father's strips in the early 1970s. In addition to writing, he currently does the inking and lettering on Beetle Bailey. Greg lives in Stamford. Neil Walker collaborated with his brothers on Betty Boop and Felix comic strip from 1984 to 1988, and produced the Beetle Bailey comic books for Scandinavia beginning in 1989. Since Mort's passing in 2018, Neil has penciled the strip and continues to write gags for Beetle Bailey. He lives in Coscob. I have been part of the creative team that produces the comic strips Beetle Bailey and Hi and Lois since 1984. I worked at the Museum of Cartoon Art from 1974 to 1992 and have curated 75 cartoon exhibits and contributed to 45 books on cartooning. I live in Wilton. I would like to end with a tribute to my cartoon brother, Chance Brown, who passed away 6 months ago. This was a recreation of his studio that we did for an exhibition at the Westport Historical Society in 2007. We all miss Chance so much. That's all, folks. There's going to be a test on that after the debate. So I hope everybody took notes. So do we have a few minutes for, I lost track of the time here, for any questions? We got a few minutes, yeah. No questions?
Just wondered, in cartooning and some of the things, did you also do the storylines, or did you had some other people collaboration as far as some of the stories?
Well, I think you'll find that every cartoonist has different working methods. Some cartoonists buy gags from gag writers. Some cartoonists do all the writing and drawing and inking and lettering and everything themselves. We write what we call gags, which are little illustrated sort of storyboards on 8.5 by 11 paper. We write a lot more than we use just to keep up the quality. And the penciling and the inking and the lettering are done by different people. In our case, other cartoonists they do all that themselves. Beetle Bailey is still done very traditionally with pencil. My brother Neil pencils it. My brother Greg does the inking and lettering. We all write gags. High and Lois is done completely digitally now. Eric Reeves does it on a tablet. So there are no originals anymore of High and Lois. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but.
Hi, this is great, and I really applaud you for the curation of the exhibition, and again, to Eva and Anne for all their work for the Westport Public Art Collections. It's really been a wonderful teamwork that you exhibited here with working with Carole and the library. It's really, really wonderful. I have a question that has to do with more of the content. You've shown an array of the history of cartooning, showing examples as far back as the 20s, and with artists, kind of present day. But how is the narrative, the style has stayed to some degree, but how has the narrative changed in terms of cultural shifts, political shifts, and things like that? The role of women, how women are portrayed, how's the content changed, though the style has stayed the same?
Have you seen my book? Yeah, it's a long story, but I would say in the beginning, even up until my father's generation, cartoonists thought of themselves as entertainers. They were there to sell newspapers, tell funny stories, thrilling stories. It wasn't so much about them or about the real world in many cases. It often reflected the real world, but it wasn't about making comments. It was mainly about entertaining. That's a very generalized statement because you can certainly come up with many, many exceptions whenever you say something like that. But I would say starting, mainly with Gary Trudeau in the 1970s, there was much more of an autobiographical trend in the comics, and certainly with female cartoonists like Lynn Johnson on For Better For Worse, and Kathy on Kathy Geiswhite, where the strips were more about them and more about their lives and more about their experiences. And that's really shifted a lot, I think. And I would also say that today cartoonists, I think of themselves as artists and not just entertainers, and they're doing what they really feel they want to express and communicate to their readers, and it's not just purely about entertainment. So in the big picture, that's the shift that I see. I know everybody wants to get home to watch the debate, but any other, maybe a last question? Oh, here we go.
It was wonderful stuff. I'm going to put you on the spot. Besides your dad, out of all those cartoonists, is there one there that you would like to have an original from sitting on your wall? I couldn't.
I do have some. I have a John Cullen Murphy Prince Valiant he gave me. John Cullen Murphy was my godfather. And when I was in my 20s, I traveled throughout Africa. And when I got back, he gave me this beautiful page. It's very early on when he started taking over from Hal Foster. And it's a beautiful lion attacking a gazelle that's hanging in my studio. I do have a Leonard Starr Annie. I love the illustrative story strip artist. A lot of those guys came out of the advertising business in the 50s. People like Stan Drake and Leonard Starr and Neil Adams and a lot of the realistic story strip artists. There was an art agency called Johnstone and Cushing where many of them worked, including Dick Brown and Gil Fox worked there as well. So those guys, I love they're such beautifully illustrated. I mean, I have a really fantastic Hagar the Horrible that Dick Brown gave me. So I don't really collect much original art because having curated so many fantastic exhibits, I'm like super spoiled.
It's really hard to choose. Yeah.
I don't own a Crazy Cat or a Little Nemo or anything that's too expensive. But most of the strips I have in my small collection are ones given to me by other artists.
Right. Yeah, those always have the most value.
Yeah.
Personally.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I thought you were going to ask me who my favorite cartoonist was. I'll tell you my 3 favorite cartoonists other than my father would be Billy DeBeck, Robert Crumb, and Dick Brown. They're all pen and ink scratchers, you know.
Hello, I'm actually a cartoonist. I was here to work on cartoons tonight and had no idea any of this was happening, so I was delighted to sit and watch this presentation. I just wanted to ask, having seen all these cartoonists and there was this amazing scene in Connecticut, how do you feel that the landscape has shifted now, like at present, with working cartoonists in Connecticut?
Well, certainly, it started happening in the 70s, but through today, now the cartoonists can work anywhere. You know, they don't have to be close to the train, across the street from the train, literally. And you know, not everything happens in New York anymore. So there are chapters like ours. I think there's maybe 22 chapters all around the country, in Florida, in California, Midwest. So there's not quite that. Even our chapter is, you know, we used to have 50 or 60 people show up to a meeting. Now I'm lucky if I can get 8 or so. So in terms of the social network of cartoonists, it's a lot more spread out. Although there is the National Cartoonist Society, and we just had our annual meeting a couple weeks ago, and it's really fun to get out of your studio for a couple days, because most of us work by ourselves, really isolated. And you get us together in a bar in the middle of the night, and things get pretty crazy, you know, because, you know, they just like being let out or something. So it's really fun to hang out with other cartoonists. But in terms of the work, you know, obviously there aren't many working editorial cartoonists anymore. The newspaper business is certainly not healthy. You know, we've lost a lot of papers in the last few years. But I don't think cartooning is dead. I think that the real growth area now is what Maria does, which is the graphic novels for young kids, because the kids buy books, and she's doing great, you know. So, you know, that's a really exciting area where cartooning is growing and expanding, and someone can make a good living doing that.
Thank you. I just wanted to say it's just fantastic to hear that there's like these thriving communities of cartoonists everywhere. That just makes me very, very happy.
Yep. Right.
Just to follow up on what you're talking about, obviously there's not as many print newspapers as there used to be. How much of the stuff of the work has gone online, and is there a real business there?
I know that there's some of these online cartoonists that talk to our conventions every year about how to make money with online comics. mainly through the sale of their books and merchandise and stuff. But it's a lot more difficult. You know, the business model of syndication, which is the business that we are still in, is sort of a dream job for a cartoonist, because you do one strip, or you do a week of strips, you send it to the syndicate, they distribute it all over the world, and then they give you a cut, which is 50, 60% of the money they collect. It doesn't take you, you know, you just do that, you know, you do one strip, but maybe millions of people read it every day. So it's like a personal franchise, and it used to be very lucrative. I wouldn't recommend cartoonists going into that career now, because the syndicates are not buying strips very much. And I think you know, we have a website that King Features runs called Comics Kingdom. You can go there and see our strips. And there's some advertising on it, but we don't make a lot of money at doing that. We still make a lot more with the newspapers.
Thank you. Thank you. Great talk.
Well, I will say in closing, it was fun to talk here tonight, and it was also a blast growing up in Fairfield County as the son of a cartoonist and having all these crazy guys come over to your house. And when I was a kid, and then I often tell this when I talk to, you know, Rotary groups and stuff, I said I was born with ink in my veins, and I used to just take it for granted that my father worked at home in his studio up on the 3rd floor. And I went to a friend's house and I said, "Where's your dad?" And he said, "Well, he's at work." "Where does he work?" "He works in Manhattan in New York." I said, "So he's not here during the day? You know, he's not here when you come home from school?" I felt so sorry for this kid, you know, and that's when I started to realize that my childhood and my family life was not normal. It was a little different. And then when I got out of college and we started the museum, and I started getting to know all these guys as people that I worked with at the museum or on exhibits and stuff, and I got to know them as adults, it was really a thrill. And looking at pictures of them, I really miss them. You know, they're not here anymore, most of them, but I think the exhibit's a great tribute to their work. So thank you for coming.